Hey everyone, it's Lucy here. Today I am so excited to talk about how you can pick up the language you've always wanted to learn, following the approach pioneered by Jeff Brown. He's not just your average language enthusiast. Jeff is a full-time college professor and polyglot who's fluent in 8 languages. His game-changing video, How to Acquire Any Language and Not Learn It, has turned heads in the language acquisition world, proving that anyone at any age can effortlessly acquire a new language without getting bogged down by grammar rules or endless vocabulary drills. But before we dive into Jeff's methods, let's take a moment to discuss another influential figure in language acquisition theory, Dr. Stephen Krashen. You might know him as the author of The Power of Reading. Dr. Krashen wears many hats. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Southern California, as well as a linguist, educational researcher, and activist. Throughout his career, Dr. Krashen has authored over 350 papers and books, making significant contributions to the fields of second language acquisition, bilingual education, and reading. His ideas, such as the acquisition learning hypothesis, the input hypothesis, and the affective filter, have shaped how we understand language learning. Recently, he's been advocating for free voluntary reading as the most powerful tool in language acquisition. Now, let's dive into Jeff Brown's video, where he reveals his groundbreaking approach to language acquisition, how to acquire any language and not learn it. In this video, Jeff shares his insights and strategies that have revolutionized the way we think about language learning. Get ready to uncover the secrets behind effortless language acquisition and discover how you can start speaking your dream language with confidence and ease. Let's get started.
I'm going to show you how to acquire a language much like a baby acquires his or her first language.
1. Acquire the language, don't learn it.
Let's talk about the difference between learning versus acquisition.
What is acquisition and what is learning?
Acquisition and learning. Acquisition means picking up a language, subconsciously absorbing the language, having a feel for it. Learning means what we did in school, knowing the rules, being able to consciously remember what they are, talk about them, etc. And the big breakthrough is that they're different. And acquisition is much more powerful than learning.
How do babies learn? Well, we know for a fact that babies don't learn language. They acquire language naturally, subconsciously, spontaneously, without even thinking about it. They acquire language through what's called comprehensible input.
So what is comprehensible input?
Comprehensible input is the input that you get if you are a native speaker child growing up in any culture. The language that adults and caregivers use with you and other siblings and other children, all other humans, is comprehensible input. So that kind of input eventually creates acquisition. We acquire language from that kind of input. Learning is sort of superimposition of conscious grammar, where we have a set of grammar rules, and so we consciously learn those. We haven't absorbed them like we did as a child, or if we learn a second language, we can also acquire it by simply living in the culture, interacting with people, and absorbing those rules. But learning is what's traditionally been done in classrooms, where there's not a lot of acquisition going on. Instead, what's happening is students are expected to memorize grammar rules and then somehow apply those when they speak.
What is wrong with grammar?
In the reviews of the research I've looked at, the studies that claim grammar worked in their experiments, in every condition, every study, those conditions were met. They were students who liked grammar, who were advanced students who had studied lots of grammar. They were thinking about rules, they had studied the rules, and they had lots of time. So this is what the monitor does. If you're saying something in another language, the sentence pops into your mind. Then, before you say it, you can inspect the sentence, think of the rules you learned, and make corrections, but it's very hard to do. It's mostly used when we give people grammar tests. On grammar tests, you can focus on form, you can think about correctness, and you have time.
In other words, grammar is extremely difficult to learn and use correctly.
How do babies learn grammar? Well, we know for a fact that babies don't learn grammar. They acquire grammar naturally, again, through comprehensible input.
Okay, so when do we learn grammar? When do we, as adults, learn grammar?
Well, we try to learn grammar when we're around 6 or 7. We have to go to school and we usually take a language class or an English class, but I never learned grammar ever.
He says he never paid attention to any grammar class and he didn't like it.
So my point is, I never learned grammar. In fact, studies show that we never learn grammar. Grammar we know comes from listening and reading through correct speech. So why study grammar? If you love grammar and you want to study grammar, that's fine. I suggest 2 things. Number 1, wait until you're fluent. Wait until you speak the language fluently or semi-fluently, then study the grammar. That's the way children do it. Or what you could do is just browse grammar. Maybe 1 minute, 2 minutes a day. Just look at it and that's it. There's a hypothesis called the monitor hypothesis. What the monitor hypothesis says is this. If you study grammar, when you go to speak the language, you're going to think of the grammar first, and it's going to get in the way. It's going to hinder your natural production of the language. 99% of your focus should be on comprehensible input. Those are things you hear or things you read, not on things you write and not on things you memorize.
We're making students monitor everything, and they've acquired very little.
2. Find the right class.
There are probably 100 different teaching methods out there. And is there a teaching method which comes closest to the way a child or a baby acquires his or her first language? And the answer is yes, there are 2. The first one is called the natural approach. The natural approach was invented in the 1970s by Drs. Stephen Krashen and Tracy Terrell. They said, hey, let's see if we can design a teaching method for foreign language classrooms where the students acquire the language most closest to the way a baby acquires his or her first language. So the natural approach was born. In a nutshell, basically in a natural approach classroom, students don't get any grammar instruction. So there's no explicit grammar instruction at all. Students acquire grammar naturally, similar or exactly the way a baby acquires his or her first grammar. Secondly, there's no correction. And number 3, in a natural approach classroom, the language is entirely done in the target language. I would say at least 90% target language, 10% English, only in emergencies, only when you really have to. The second teaching method is called TPRS, and TPRS is used mainly in high schools and elementary schools and middle schools. TPRS stands for Teaching Proficiency Through Reading and Storytelling. Basically what TPRS does is students acquire the language through storytelling, and then they augment that or they reinforce that with reading. So the class revolves around storytelling, and then after the story, there's reading to accompany the storytelling, or they read at home.
How do we know the natural approach works?
During the 1970s, they did an experiment, and the experiment was done at UCI, or UC Irvine. And what they did it using German courses. They took 3 or 4 German courses, and they taught half of the courses using traditional methods. That's grammar translation, explicit grammar instruction, etc. And then they took the other German courses and they taught them using the natural approach. And then at the end of the semester or the end of the year, they tested the students, and the results were astounding. The natural approach students scored higher on almost every level. The natural approach students remembered more words, and they were able to speak for a longer period of time. Now, more recently, another test was done by an instructor named Dr. Beniko Mason. Dr. Mason is a professor of English in Osaka, Japan. And what Dr. Mason does is she teaches using story listening. Story listening is a wonderful form of comprehensible inputs. The natural approach, storytelling, story listening, they all go together hand in hand. So once again, Dr. Mason did this test. She taught half of her courses using traditional methods, and then she taught the other half of the courses using story listening or comprehensible input. And then she tested them after 5 weeks to see how many words they would remember. And again, the results were astounding. The traditional approach students remembered 36% of the words, and the story listening or comprehensible input students remembered 75% of the words. So over the years, many tests have been done. The natural approach versus traditional approach, TPR storytelling, story listening, etc. versus traditional methods, and the natural approach, storytelling, story listening has beat the traditional methods in every case.
3 is find the right instructor.
You should have the illusion that the class is entirely in the target language.
So if we are in an English class, using Korean here and there for help, etc., is perfectly fine. But
You do too much of it, you're not getting any comprehensible input. And you're going to wind up easily doing 90%, easily doing 95%. You probably wind up doing 98%.
If it's going to be 90%, it can't just be above the student's level. And I used to give workshops, and instructors would come up to me and they'd say, well, I tried speaking Spanish to my students, but they didn't understand me. And I'm like, well, yeah, your kid won't understand you either. If you're talking about inflation to a 2-year-old, you have to talk about their brand new shoes and the toy truck they're holding or the cute bow they have in their hair. You have to bring it down to their levels. And it's a lot of work. It's way, way easier to just give them a bunch of grammar exercises. This is way more work.
It's easier to stop and explain a grammatical structure, but it doesn't help the student acquire the language.
One of the problems I see is a lot of students spend tons and tons of hours writing the language, memorizing characters, etc. And they spend very little time comprehensible input, listening to the language, reading the language, speaking the language. So that's a huge mistake that I see a lot of students doing. So I'm going to suggest forget about reading and writing until you're fluent in the language or semi-fluent in the language, just like a baby acquires his or her first language.
4 is find language parents, as many as you can.
You need a language parent, somebody who's going to help you acquire the language, somebody who speaks the language that you want to acquire and help you acquire that language. Now, what if you can't find enough people to be your language parents? Another great resource is trades. What are trades? Trades are basically language exchanges. That means you're going to need to find people who speak the language that you want to acquire, and you're going to trade them for the language that you already speak. So what are you going to do once you sit down with your language parent, your language partner, your trade, etc.? This is the most important part of the entire language acquisition program. You need 2 things. Number 1, you're going to need magazines. And number 2, children's stories. It doesn't matter what language the magazines are in, and it doesn't matter what language the children's stories are in. The important thing is that the magazines have tons and tons of pictures. Now, this magazine is Sunset Magazine. The reason I love Sunset Magazine is it has tons of great pictures. Sunset Magazine is a travel magazine, which means it's going to have pictures related to travel, food, clothing, accessories, ads, etc. So when you sit down with your language friend, you're going to ask him or her to lovingly describe all of the pictures in the magazine. And while he or she's doing that, the way you participate is this. He or she's going to ask you simple yes or no questions about the pictures in the magazine. And then you are going to ask some super simple questions too. And the most simple questions are, what is this? What's that? What's he doing? What's she doing? And why? Why is the most important question in any language. So let me talk about storytelling in general. Storytelling is the most powerful way to acquire any language. I cannot say enough good about storytelling for language acquisition. Just like magazines, your language partner, your language friend, she's not going to translate the story. He or she won't need to translate the story because the pictures are very big. It's very easy to follow. It's a children's story. He or she is going to lovingly retell you the story in the target language. And she's going to ask you simple yes or no questions. And you're going to want to participate. So you're going to ask, what's this? What's that? What's he doing? What's she doing? And why? Remember, language acquisition is all about listening and not speaking. So when he or she's retelling the story, you're acquiring the language through listening and not speaking. Once you sit down with your language parent, your language partner, etc., you need to tell them that you have 3 or 4 very important rules.
So rule number 1 is no Korean. You need to tell that person during our language session together, please don't speak any Korean at all.
Now, if you don't understand and I don't understand, you have 2 or 3 options. My favorite option is just to gesture. You're going to act it out. You're going to try to get the person to understand what you're trying to say. And the way you do that is through gestures or acting. And that works a lot of time. Number 2, if you and I don't understand, you're going to draw. I want to stay in the target language about 99% of the time. If at any time you don't understand and I don't understand and we're stuck, it's not important. So we're going to say that in the target language. We're going to say, you know what? It's not important. Let's move on. Let's go to the next topic. Rule number 2 is no grammar. I'm going to be acquiring grammar naturally, like a child acquires first grammar. And rule number 3, no corrections. I'm going to ask my friend, please don't correct me at any time. And the reason is correction does not work. It's basically a waste of time.
5 is TPR.
TPR stands for total physical response.
It's learning a language through movement, acquiring a language through movement. Science shows that it's one of the most powerful teaching techniques that we can use in a classroom.
Every foreign language acquisition program should include lots of TPR or lots of commands. So let me tell you how it works. Basically, what you're going to do is when you get with your language parent or whatever you're with, ask that person to give you a list of commands or verbs or actions. Eat, drink, jump, sleep, dance, sing, complain, talk, turn around, jump, run, anything like that.
And 6 is read, read, and read.
Reading is fantastic. The other great thing about reading is that you can so tailor it to the student's interests. It's one of the first things that I recommend to students right from the beginning. If you can start reading little things, particularly things that you're passionate about anyways. If you love baseball and you've just watched a game and you already know what the results are, now go online to a newspaper and read a little bit about the game. You won't understand most of the words. That's okay. You already know what the results were, so you start getting comfortable. You have this whole context behind it.
What reading does is it puts everything together. In fact, it takes all that grammar that you've been wondering about, and what it does is little by little, it just puts it all together. It's almost like you have this puzzle. It smooths out the pieces in the puzzle so you can put that puzzle together easily. A lot of our grammar, the grammar I've acquired, has come from reading. So reading is hugely important.
According to Professor Beniko Mason at Osaka University, Japan, who is also the founder of Story Listening, students who have read 100 to 150 pages per week had the best results. 7 is I plus 1.
I plus 1 simply means input plus 1. Input is everything I know, and then the 1 is just a little bit extra.
Plus 1 is going slightly beyond that level.
I plus 1 is super simple. And what it means is they're going to give you vocabulary, but they're just going to be giving you a little bit extra than they normally would. For example, this is a camping scene, and this is a trailer, and there's a beach, and these are rocks, and this is a spare tire. They've got a spare tire. Spare tire is very important. You could have a blowout, and then the spare tire you need to use. This trailer looks vintage, looks like a vintage trailer. It looks really expensive. I wish I had a trailer like that. So that's an example of I plus 1. You never just want to jump in and say, trailer, beach, grass, sun, water. No. You want your partner to give you this loving explanation. Again, like you're the baby and he or she is mom or dad.
What about correction? Why no corrections?
Ineffective. How's that? And I recommend the work of a guy named John Truscott. He's a professor of English in Taiwan. He has reviewed the literature on correction more thoroughly than I have. I've done my best, but John has done a better job over and over again. It is not effective. You make a mistake, someone corrects you, you're supposed to change your idea of what the rule is. In reality, it only works when the rule is very, very simple and you've studied it, you've time to think about it, and you're focused on form. So it's the same constraints as grammar. And when correction does work, and when formal instruction does work, the effect doesn't last very long. It fades away after a few months. Most of the gain is gone.
Memorization is not comprehensible input. In fact, you could memorize the entire dictionary and you would still not speak the language. It just doesn't work that way.
And finally, number 8, use your mobile phone.
The mobile phone. I'm going to be using the recording device on my mobile phone. I'm going to be recording all of my sessions, and then just during the week, maybe a half hour before I go to bed or an hour a day in my car, I'm going to listen to those recordings over again, and that is absolute comprehensible input. It doesn't matter that I've heard it before. In fact, it's important that I hear it again. Now, more importantly, I'm going to be recording the children's story sessions because what I want is I want a whole list of stories. I want 100 different stories, children's stories on my mobile phone that I can listen to anytime to keep current, to keep my fluency, whatever my fluency level is. And I'm going to do that over and over and over again. And I'm going to do that for the rest of my life.